Let's start our first plenary session. My name is Igor Shияn, and I'm representing Moscow City University. And it's a pleasure and honor for me to moderate the first plenary session at our symposium. We have two presentations today at this first session. But before that, I would like to invite Dr. Igor Rimarenko, corresponding member of Russian Academy of Education and rector of Moscow City University, who had the chance to join us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Igor. I'm very pleased to see all you here. Despite of this coronavirus problem, we will continue our symposium, and I'm happy to invite all participants to share their ideas and to see all of you here in our Moscow environment, in our university. I would like to say that previous period, COVID period, give us additional questions to discuss in the situation when we are talking about city in the university. First of all, if we are talking about education, we have to discuss what kind of technologies, new technologies appeared those period, because of course we have a absolutely different situation with different methods of education, with different technologies in education, if we compare before COVID period and nowadays. Of course, recently we discussed with school head teachers with situation, and we have to mark that today, next year, we will see that some meetings, some events in schools will organize by digital technologies, especially if we are talking about parents' meeting. Parents' meeting were always typical situation for Russian schools. Then we have some conversation about education in schools between teachers and parents, and we have to mark for bulk of cities. We have to say that a lot of those meetings will organize in with digital technologies, with using web conferences. It's difficult to imagine that some school launch meetings with face-to-face conversation, because we have to say some of our reality absolutely dramatically transformed by digital technologies. Another realm we have to say is city and education. Of course, feelings about cities, our perception of city, our thoughts about city also changed. We have to say city in our mindfulness is a little bit another. We have to say, and when we are talking about our discussions, teachers and students, instructors and students about city for nowadays, a little bit another, a little bit more than previous time. Of course, if you are talking about a typical city environment, museums, libraries, clubs, or sports facilities, we have to say it's another than before COVID period. And for us, for universities, the most important thing, I think so, research. If you're talking about research, do we have same agenda like before COVID period, or a little bit another? Or we have to say we have another agenda using digital technologies and using new relationship in the citizenships with this period. Of course, I think we have to say the spheres of research changed for nowadays. That's why I would like to say that our perspectives, our meetings, our symposiums in future will be more and will be changed if we compare with before COVID-19 period. And I hope all speeches, all papers will be very interesting. I would like to say we will see a lot of interesting ideas. We will share with different ideas. I hope it will be a very interesting conference. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Igor. I'm happy to invite Joe O'Hara, President of European Educational Research Association, ERA, and Professor and Director of Center for Evaluation, Quality and Inspection in Dublin City University, Ireland, our long-term partner and colleague. His presentation's title is Enhancing University Community Engagement, Reconceptualizing the Third Mission in Higher Education in a Post-COVID context. Joe, you're welcome to speak.
Thank you, Igor, and also thank you to Director Igor as well for a very interesting way of framing what I want to talk about now. I think he's touched on many of the themes that I'd like to speak about and I'd like to talk about. If I can manage to share my screen, I'll be very excited. So let's go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Right.
If you may go in a little bit, even better. Yeah.
Is that okay? So, as Igor said, and as I may have mentioned in the few opening remarks I made earlier this morning, what I'm interested in looking at this morning is the extent to which the way in which we think about the connection between universities and the community, between universities and the city, has been changed over the last 18 months to 2 years. And to do this, I'd like to use a framing that we've discussed a number of times in these international symposiums, which is the idea of the different missions of the university, and particularly the third mission of the university, which we'll come to later on. And to consider if the reality of the pandemic experience that we're living through has impacted on the reality of the third mission, on the way we think about the third mission, and on the realism of implementing this third mission. So fundamentally, this is what I'd like to talk about this morning for about the next 20 minutes. Perhaps to begin by looking at what is the higher education context, or what was it as we moved into January 2020? And how did we think then of the different core missions of education, the three being, as Igor has just mentioned a second ago, research, education and teaching, and engagement. And then how has this been changed? How do we rethink this in the in a post-COVID situation, or in a COVID situation? And I suppose part of the challenge around this, and maybe this is for conversation over the next couple of days, is the extent to which what we're going to move into will be a return to normal, whether it'll be a new normal, or whether it'll be something that we just haven't conceived of either. And I think in some ways we're at the cusp of something very interesting, but we don't know where we're going with it. So broadly speaking, that's the shape of what I'd like to look at for the next while. So what's the context? What are the narratives that have underpinned our discussions of higher education, and how does COVID impact on that? One of the challenges, I think, for any of us involved in higher education is the sheer complexity of it. And it's the sheer complex demands that are increasingly being imposed in higher education. As higher education and as the concept of lifelong education and lifelong learning and credentializing or lifelong learning has become more and more important, particularly as a driver for economic and social development, there has been a huge amount of pressure, a huge amount of differing requirements placed on higher education institutions, and a number of at times competing and contradictory different groupings who feel that higher education should be shaped in a manner that addresses their particular needs. So some of the more common ones we think of here. So we've got employers, the state, civic society, students. And each of these groups has a very legitimate set of concerns about, well, what is the function of higher education? As I said a moment ago, over the last 25 to 30 years in particular, the scholarship and the social and the social drive towards the idea of linking education and higher education to economic and social development has been particularly strong, and international bodies such as the OECD particularly push this idea. So employers have a very strong and vested interest in higher education, and quite often their narrative and their discussion is around the idea of skill requirements, of competencies, of the capacities of higher education students on graduation to do specific things, to be work ready, to be studying courses that are economically useful. We know this language. It's the instrumentalization, or the vocationalization of certain aspects of higher education, which is a very long tradition. But it's the concept that higher education is there to provide a pathway for individuals to move from compulsory schooling into the world of work, carrying with them very useful skills, which will have a social benefit, which if we go to the bottom quadrant, the state clearly has an interest in that as well. Higher education, which is massively invested in many countries, must meet economic requirements as well. Quite often states frame their conversation around their investment of higher education in economic terms, the benefits it brings to the economy and to our capacities as states to create the structures and to create the capacity to develop jobs and to bring income and to do all the things that the state feels it needs to do. So there's a strong economic element. But there's also a strong social cohesion and equality element. Again, there's a recognition, or at least there has been a recognition, that higher education is a way of tying together at times disparate communities by bringing people together and giving them an opportunity to live, share, work, learn, create relationships with people maybe that they wouldn't have met before, or in a context that they wouldn't have met before, and to expose them and to open them to ideas that they wouldn't have thought of before. And in a small country like Ireland, that's not necessarily as hugely important, or it is important. In a massive country like Russia, I think this can be seen as being particularly challenging, as it does in many of the big countries. And also at a European level, which I think is quite interesting from ourselves, is that in the video we watched a few minutes ago, MCU was seen as being very important in Erasmus+, and this underpins the concept. Erasmus+ underpins the idea of social cohesion being contributed to by higher education mobility and the sharing of ideas and experiences. So this concept is very important as well. Knowledge transfer is really important between the state, between universities and the broader society, and maybe universities and cities. And many of us have innovation campuses in our city universities. And then, as Igor mentioned a few minutes ago, the centrality of research to the driving of social development. And then we've got maybe two other quadrants, the students themselves. And I don't think we should ever really forget that. And perhaps the last year and a half has demonstrated the essential nature of the experience of the student in higher education. As we moved from face-to-face teaching to online teaching, it became a very challenging aspect for many students. And suddenly higher education was shown in its complexity when it was stripped down to the bare idea that, well, all we're doing now is speaking to a computer. It became a very challenging experience for many students. And that's very important. And it's very important to think about this in terms of what happens with students. So whether it be the school, the full-time school student leaving and coming into higher education, but also particularly in the last number of years, the retraining and the rethinking of what we do and thinking about ourselves as lifelong learners, which has been a theme for 30 years and is becoming increasingly important, and also of professional development. And then finally, but not finally in a way, it's the idea of civic society, even beyond the state and the organs of the state and the structures of the state, the concept that higher education has a role to engage with the broader community, with the broader civic society, whether it be community organizations, whether it be environmental groups, women's groups, NGOs. I thought our colleague from Taipei, speaking about the importance of SDGs, again, they're very important to our university, indicates how higher education has such an important role in embedding and facilitating discussion of civically developmental ideas. And this is critically important for us. But this is hugely complex, and anybody who has ever been in a management or a responsible position in higher education understands the pressures that this brings on us. And at times, although not always, but perhaps up to 2020, there was a challenge then, and there was something of a gridlock because of the multiple demands being placed on a lot of higher education. And it's not all the time, and many of us have worked in institutions that are very, very innovative. But perhaps at a macro scale, there's been a real attempt, or there had been a difficulty in rethinking and reconceptualizing, to use that word. How do you meet the needs of all these different constituencies? And how do we create a policy structure and a policy framework that allows us to develop those and allows us to work through those? And a lot of the things here we have here. So quite often you have things like skill level requirements, accountability structures, economic development, social movements, demographic changes, which are pushing in one way. And then in another way, the challenges of, and this is a universal experience, I think, declining public investment, the need for universities, for higher education to find different sources of income, the increasing precarity in terms of jobs. Tenured academic positions are becoming rarer and rarer in many systems. The constant audit culture within structures, which take more and more academic time away from what many academics consider to be their core mission of teaching and research. But for those who are funding or who are working through this, saying, well, no, you have to be able to show that what you're doing is valid and meets the requirements. The issue of quality that this seminar is about. Again, league tables and international measurements. Each of the organizing institutions in this symposium talks about itself in the context of international rankings very successfully, but these are new pressures as well on us. Competition in terms of research, and then also student expectations. What do students expect? One of the interesting changes over the last number of decades has been the idea of the student as the consumer becoming a dominant mode in many, particularly English-speaking university systems, that we're serving them as consumers as opposed to students, and therefore you charge them a lot of money, but they have high expectations, and this goes back to what we spoke about a moment ago in relation to the challenges that faced during the COVID period. And sorry, that's just making the point in Russian for that. So I think the underpinning idea here was that there was a huge challenge in terms of where higher education was moving, and it was becoming difficult to maneuver, not impossible, but there were lots of pressures on the higher education system around the world as we think about it. And then again, to pick up on Igor's point of earlier on, of there is then a really interesting question and point as well. Look, what is the function of the university? And traditionally, perhaps we've seen two key functions. There's research and education. And depending on which tradition you come from, or depending on how your system has emerged over the last 200 to 300 years, at different times, different elements of this have been prioritized, whether it be the pure research or the teaching university or the combination of the two. If you're the Humboldtian, the idea of the integrated teaching and research and the community of everybody from junior researchers up to senior professors working together to create new objective knowledge. My own confrere or my own countryman, John Henry Newman, talking about the idea of the university about being more than just knowledge, also the development of the person, and many other different ideas coming into the concept of what it means. But at the core, for a lot of people, when they discuss universities, they discuss the idea of it being focused on research and education. And at times, there's different balances here. And for those of us involved in the education sciences, involved in the process and the ways of thinking about teaching, this is very important that we think about where our balance is, because I think we may be committed pedagogues and yet we're still required to research, and I think that's quite important. But then, of course, the argument I would make, and the argument that I think is increasingly is made, that it's not just education and research, that there is a third leg to the stool, and that's the idea of engagement. And this is the university mission, thinking about the university mission in a third way, which is the one of engagement. So there's definitely teaching, there's definitely research, but there's also that of engagement. And it's that I'd like to think about for the next 10 minutes or so and look at it in the context, particularly of COVID. So if we say that the first two missions are research and teaching, then the third mission is engagement. But one of the interesting challenges is that how do we define this? So over the last 20 years, we did a number of different times to do it. So here it's talking about harnessing what we know in universities and using them outside traditional academic environments. So it's moving beyond the walls of the university, very much part of the theme of this conference. A second, again, connecting to the theme of the conference, it's the idea that the old idea of the ivory tower, which is very powerful within English and Irish education, for example, that you're separate from, no longer holds. Higher education institutions and universities are now seen as being essentially interconnected. So the walls are down and we're part of the community. And again, I think this underpins our symposium and our theme in the symposium here as well. We're part of a city and of a changing city. And there's a huge number of external constituencies that we're involved with. And as the idea develops, and the most recent quote here is only from a few weeks ago, it's the idea that we need to switch to this engagement mode. This is what the third mission fundamentally challenges us to do. It's not just passively saying we need to engage. It's an active transition to an engagement mode. It's finding a way of doing this. Now, part of the challenge, going back to what we were speaking about earlier on, is defining, well, what does the active transition mean? What does the engagement mode mean? And there's a number of different things that you can see there, whether it's around technology, companies, knowledge exchange, regional development, CPD, or work-based learning. So this is very much taking it from the employer, perhaps state and economic development. And in a number of universities, this is how they define this is how they define engagement. It's really plugging it in and linking it very clearly into the idea of the economic and technological and employment and sectors, and finding a way of doing that. A second one then is perhaps the more civic platform and the cultural engagement, where we think about things like community service and social and civic engagement, where we look at the social aspect and the social dimension of what we do as educators working within a community setting, how we think about universal social responsibility, how we define that idea. What is our responsibility as an educational institution at the higher end or at the top end of the continuum in terms of our commitment to the society around us? And then how do we bring the different constituencies and the different stakeholders into this situation? And again, there's many groups pushing this as well. I suppose the function I'm trying to make here is that, or what the point I'm trying to make is that even as we discuss the third mission and the idea of engagement, there's still a lot of areas that we need to think about, that we need to think through if we're going to find a way of doing it. So some practical ways you might do it, I mean, at an education level, is incorporating social responsibility themes into the curricula, as many universities now do. They're part of the structure is to think about the impact of what we're doing on our thing, on our broader society. In terms of research, is to find new ways of transferring knowledge to society, which we'll look at in a few minutes. But this has become increasingly important in the last maybe year to 18 months as well. Research isn't just for ourselves as higher education professionals; it's also for society. It's management. It's how we run our institutions internally. That we make sure that they in and of themselves are engaging and supportive of those who work within them. So we model actively in terms of our internal structures what we think that the broader external structure should have. And then, of course, community engagement, which is looking at, as we mentioned already, the SDGs is one way of doing this, but thinking about how do we facilitate communities developing and enhancing their own capacities and skills. And these are very challenging elements, thinking about all the other things we need to do in higher education, but at least there's something of a roadmap there, and there's an idea there. And this roadmap has been, I suppose, developing over a decade or so. And perhaps, again, speaking about this a few months ago, basically said, the point he tries to make is that we need to find ways as universities to work together to address the complex needs that societies are facing, and then to find ways to allow societies develop in a way that are more just and peaceful and equitable and sustainable, which of course is an increasingly critical element for all of us. Quite a broad canvas of things that we need to do. And then, as Igor mentioned a few minutes ago, we have COVID-19. We have the enormous international block, full stop, on our everyday life that happened in January, February, March of last year. And suddenly you began to see the concept of the different missions of the universities really come into their own and really begin to be presented in different ways. So you have had a massive amount of research internationally around COVID-19, around what it is, how it works, how it impacts at a medical scientific level. And many of the innovations and many of the ideas that have emerged have come from that nexus between higher education, medical education, pharmaceutical industries, all these things. So you have an enormous amount of research going on in universities worldwide around COVID-19, and then at the ancillary levels as well, looking at how it impacts socially and all of the different elements. So there's huge research going on. I say every single one of the institutions we represent has some work being done. I know in ERA, in the body I'm president of, like a very simple idea, our journal ran a special issue on COVID-19 and received 185 separate submissions to one special issue discussing the work that educational researchers around Europe were doing in relation to COVID-19. And that was within 6 months of the emergence of the virus. So there's an enormous academic work going on in relation to this at a research level across all of the disciplines that we work in. And that's as it should be, because it's such a profound international thing. At the teaching level, we've had, I just took this from the MCU Facebook page, we've all transitioned to digital teaching. We're doing it now. And at that level, it's hugely interesting to see how that's worked and how we've developed through that. And we've had to see how that's developed. And that's been a supportive thing there as well. At a third level then, just to give you an idea of my own university, we've set up a research innovation hub, which includes absolutely teaching. It includes absolutely research, but it also brings in economic and societies who begins to try and integrate the different elements of this. And again, I think that's important also. And then if we move specifically into educational research is what we're talking about, we've begun to rethink what it means to be a researcher and an educational researcher, which I think is important. We've begun to think about what does it mean to teach? And Igor mentioned the pivot to online. And I've mentioned a few times the underpinning pressures that face many of us in relation to what we do as higher education institutions with regards to what we value and what we think is important. And then the third aspect, again, that was mentioned earlier on, I think is the idea of the permeability of educational spaces. Suddenly, where education takes place and who has a right to talk about education has changed. Particularly in primary and secondary level education, a lot of it took place at home, and a lot of it took place in a context where it was parentally supported. And trying to draw on their experiences and draw on the experience of the students in that context and listen to it and listen to how that's actually worked is very challenging. And yet it's one of the hugely important elements of how we rethink what we're doing as we work within the city. There is the other big challenge that, and it's too big for this thing, but just to mention, we're also working in a period when the concept of expertise and specialism and knowledge is under challenge in a way that maybe it hasn't been before. And that's a big challenge to us in higher education also. So what are we going to do then? Well, I think, how do we do this? I think there's a couple of ways of doing it. We talk about valuing other voices. How do we bring in different elements to this? So we think about how we include voices that maybe traditionally weren't involved in it. We think about building capacity within a broader city context or a broader higher education context. We think about finding a shared language. And that's not necessarily easy because we do speak to each other at times in relatively esoteric and relatively complex linguistic ways. So we need to find a way of doing that. We need to think about then mobilizing our knowledge. We as experts, and I use that phrase legitimately, how do we find a way of using the knowledge that we have to facilitate, in the context of this symposium, the development of the communities and the cities around us? And really interestingly, I think, at last year's symposium, colleagues from DCU and from Moscow City University, working with other city universities, came up with the idea of rethinking the learning space. And I'd encourage you all to read this wonderful paper because it actually thinks about how do we actually mobilize what we as city universities know in order to influence the society around us. And not accidentally, I think, separately, but in parallel, what our colleagues came up with in this paper were the three things we've been speaking about there. We need engagement in terms of the presentation of what we do. They talk about more active user engagement. They talk about in our universities developing new form of teaching. And they talk about popularizing research. So the three aspects of the university mission that are at the core of the idea that I'm putting forward here emerge separately from this joint research between our three, between our universities. And I think that's really significant. And then what they then say, and I think this is the roadmap perhaps for all of us, is how we brand ourselves as a partner of the city, is that we begin to see the city as being a core element of all these things. It's the core element of the engagement, of the teaching, and of the research. In DCU, we've moved one stage further in relation to this, and we've set up a Centre for Engaged Research, a formal structure within the university. And there's other ones as well, very similar to your own work in Moscow City University around the Silver University. We've got the Age-Friendly University. So it's these ideas of finding ways of engaging what we do. I won't go through all of these because there's perhaps too many of them. But what I'd like to say is that each of the activities of this Centre for Engaged Research involves moving from our traditional structures into new places with new people. And you can see things like partnership, co-creating, rebuilding. And I think as we move in the post-COVID period, this is where we'll be thinking of. We'll be thinking of renewing or creating partnerships, of co-creating the idea of a community and of moving forward. But there are challenges. There are huge challenges here. There's a commitment in terms of time and resources, and perhaps a commitment to the very idea of it, We're clearly very committed to it, but there is a challenge because not everybody will be. Some still have the idea of the unique elite university that does its own thing, which then links into our other issues around the other theme of our conference, which is quality. If we're going to value this type of element of university mission, we have to also value it in terms of how we define quality. And I think that's an enormous challenge to us, because many of our traditional methods and metrics for discussing quality don't necessarily talk about the type of thing we're talking about here, because it's difficult to measure and difficult to engage. So we need to think about that. How do we do this? How do we find the measure that allows us value what we do in this way? And then I suppose it's to finish with is, well, where are we? I love quoting Gramsci, because I think one of the issues is we don't really know where we are with COVID. We're still in the middle of it. I mean, are we moving to a new normal? Are we moving back somewhere else? Where are we going to in relation to this? And the point I think he's trying to make here is that we haven't left the past behind, but we haven't really reached the future. So we're in this extraordinary liminal space between the two, and we need to think about where does that go and how does that impact on the way that we as universities committed to engaging with the cities are going to be able to do things and are going to be able to change our focus around our function in order to allow us enhance the communities and the cities around us in a modern way. So thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Yes, thank you so much, Joe. We have a few questions in the chat, because some people are attending us by the YouTube. But before I will read some questions from the chat, maybe somebody who is present here in Zoom have any questions to this great presentation. Well, so let me start from the YouTube question. First question is from Gennady Klinov, and he asked about the balance between education, research, and engagement, and how this balance depends on the specifics of city social cultural situation. So how the balance of research, education, and
I think that point is absolutely correct. I think, and in some ways, that's why fora like this are so important, because I think each of us emerges from a particular educational and cultural context and a specific disciplinary context as well. And the balance will be different across each of these. So the balance, for example, in the area that I'm in, which is education, teaching, and teacher education, clearly there's a great deal of community engagement because our graduates move into schools and are a core element of the development of the social fabric around us, which may be different to a different disciplinary area. And I think what we need to do is acknowledge that the balance will be different, but to find ways of sharing experiences from our different contexts to allow us at least come up with a set of principles and a set of ways of thinking about what we're going to do. We can't have, I think the danger with all of these discussions is we come up with a model and say, this has now to be introduced. I think we need to turn it on its head. And again, going back to what I said earlier on, it's why I like this seminar so much, because it allows us to learn from the experiences of others to see what can we learn in dialogue to develop, some of which is applicable, some of which isn't. But I think we do. I think it's a really good question. We have to acknowledge the nature of the balance and the challenge of the balance. But there's no one answer to it. It has to emerge organically from the situation that you're in.
Yes, thank you so much, Joe. And one more question about the ideal model of relationship between the city university and the local government. What's your opinion on these questions in the perspective of those three missions that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult, again, to give an absolute thing. It depends, of course, on let's be basic about this. Sometimes there's a funding relationship between a city university and a government. Sometimes there isn't a funding relationship. So it depends on the connection in terms of the capacity for the city government to contribute to the running of the university and financially and in many different ways. And then the city university, I think, has a right to engage in a very strong dialogue about what it needs. But the city also needs to have an openness to the reality that perhaps in the university, you've got almost an innovation laboratory. You have the opportunity, if you were a city, in a university in your city, to allow new ideas emerge. It's a place where innovation can happen, where ideas can be tried out, and where innovative solutions to long-term problems can emerge in a very organic way. And because you have the connection, those solutions fit the problems within the particular city situation. So I think in some ways it can be very reductive. It's like, we pay for you, so therefore you have to do what we tell you. Whereas if we turn it on the head, it's like, look, you've got an extraordinary collection of talented, committed people in an institution that's linked to our city who want to do well for the city. Give them an opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe, for this broad answer. And I see the question from Igor Morenko.
Yes, thank you, Joe, for brilliant presentation. It's always from you is so interesting. I have question about entity of university. Then you showed this third lack of chair, lack of stool. We are talking about dramatical changing in university, and we can say that we have in university environment and university people some obstacles, some innate hindrances. What kind of obstacle we have to mention if we are talking about third mission of university? Maybe some special research relationship between researchers or something like that.
Yeah, I think, Igor, you've put your finger on one of the big challenges there. So one of my last slides, I had the idea of the philosophical problem. For many people involved in universities and higher education, they don't see themselves as having a commitment to engagement. They see themselves drawing on maybe an older view of what a higher education professional is an expert in a field who's going to create new knowledge that in and of itself is valuable. And how that's applied isn't really their role. You know, they're there to create new knowledge, and that knowledge is applicable, and it's up to others to decide to do that. Theirs is not an applied area, it's a pure area. And that's a challenge, because that's a very strong traditional concept of what it means to be an academician, to be an expert within higher education. And in some ways, there needs to be a cultural change to try and explain from a very early period within the education of higher education professionals that we now have a new type of engagement in terms of the broader society. So that's, I think that's one question. The second question is, and I noted both your own institution, my own institution, we're celebrating during the year our role in the QS surveys and how we've done very well within them. A lot of the time, the metrics that are used to measure in these international league tables or measures of quality, while they pay lip service to the ideas of engagement, they still focus around research and reputation. So oftentimes the obstacles internally to engagement are also are obstacles that we face because we're trying to present ourselves in a way that allows us to be acknowledged and recognized internationally. And I think that's a big challenge to us. If our international standing is decided by our research outputs and our research income in terms of that, and maybe in terms of our reputation, which tends to build on research, it can be really hard then to find a space to put engagement in. Now, many of the international bodies are trying to find ways around this, but we need to keep pushing this. So two very simple things then. trying to think about how we train the next generation of colleagues to see that engagement is at the core of what we do. It's not just something we do afterwards. And secondly, continuing to push, as this seminar is, to redefine quality and measures of quality. So engagement becomes a core of them, not something that's attached at the end.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the last question in the chat is about the digital reality. And the question is either is it helpful for the engagement from your perspective, or it creates more difficulties for engagement in digital?
The fact that we're online all the time is, I think it can be either or. A typical academic answer. It can be either or both. Like what it does do, it facilitates access in a way that we've never really had before. So many of the meetings and conferences you go to, and many of the settings you go to, people can be included in a way that they haven't been included before because they can physically, they don't have to travel. The question is, and I'm not an expert on this, but the question is the capacity to create meaningful, engaged interactions over an extended period that lead to meaningful actions in a digital space. So can we create relationships in this type of space that allow us then individually go and change what we do in the broader social space that we live in? And I don't think we have sufficient research yet to answer that. Some aspects, yes, some aspects, no, but I think it's too early to say, but we need to keep thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe, and thank you so much for bringing this concept of engagement, this rich concept, I would say. I'm always struggling translating into Russia, and we have a lot of meanings both in English and I think the presentations like you did, it's really helpful. We don't have to probably to define it just once forever, but just we are going to describe it from the different angles. And thank you so much for your great presentation and for your being with us. And we hope that you will have a chance to participate more in our symposium. Thank you. And I'm inviting Monika Майни, assistant professor and at National University of Educational Planning and Administration from New Delhi, India. And Monika is going to speak more specifically about the student's voice in higher education. So the whole topic of her presentation is higher education in urban context, students' voice in higher education. Monika, you're welcome to speak.
Доброе утро. Надеюсь, что вы меня хорошо слышите. Еще нет? Сейчас слышите? Может быть, вам немножко подальше от экрана нужно быть. Моя презентация о новым подходам к деятельности студентов в установлении социальной справедливости. Основной подход здесь в последние годы студенческое мнение все более и более становилось возможным, интересным.
Public universities. They were marked by a series of protests that began.
И в 2016 году впервые это началось после того, как один из студентов был исключен из университета. И дальше были протесты под управлением студента коллег Умара в университете Джаву, который стал известным как JNU, случай по предательству. И дальше студенты потребовали, чтобы активисты этой деятельности, которые были задержаны, были выпущены на свободу. и так далее и тому подобное. Этот случай стал неким ключевым моментом в развитии политической культуры и деятельности в индийских университетах. Власти стали изображать, позиционировать студенческую деятельность как опасную для страны, что привело к дальнейшему воздействию властей на деятельность студентов, на подавление их голосов, особенно там, где речь заходила о неолиберальной повестке дня и запрещению критического мышления. Основная задача была перед студентом была поставлена получить диплом и найти работу. Также делаются попытки описать студенческую деятельность как деятельность отдельных радикальных групп. Это отдельные небольшие группы, которые имеют радикальную политическую ориентацию, и они мутят воду. Но при этом стала развиваться дискуссия относительно того, какова действительно роль учащихся в политической и социальной деятельности страны. Эта роль была обсуждена педагогами и либеральными политическими деятельностями, и стало понятным, что студентам дано право и должно быть дано право бороться за свои права. Согласно профессору Научомски, деятельность студенчества сегодня очень важна. Она является организованным важным сегментом интеллектуального сообщества и имеет практически важную роль в общественной жизни, в общественной деятельности. Студенты могут играть ведущую роль в нейтрализации негативных тенденций в обществе, таких как корпоративный конформизм. Они могут изменить общественные мнения и общественный диалог и бороться с социоэкономическим неравенством. Также, конечно, понимается, что студенты находятся на службе защиты демократии. Студенческий активизм очень важен. Он приводит к более глубокому пониманию, как этот мир организован, как он взаимодействует и как мы можем, в принципе, иметь дело с социальной несправедливостью. Основные вопросы, которые возникают здесь: каково место студенческой деятельности в университете, являются студенты ответственными за изменения в ситуации с социальной справедливостью, какова действительно полезная и активная деятельность студентов в плане изменений демократической деятельности и так далее. Начнем с философского осмысления того, что представляет собой университет. В университете студенты должны видеть себя как взаимодействующие. Должно иметь место быть множественность опыта, совместное взаимодействие, коллективное мышление, командный дух, деятельность на благо своей группы, на благо сообщества, понимание своей роли в этой деятельности. Их деятельность должны быть совместными, и они должны понимать, что это действие является и добровольной. Однако мы против применения насилия и подавления их прав. студенческая деятельность становится очень важной ролью во имя восстановления социальной справедливости и также осознание того, как учащиеся взаимодействуют с другими учащимися и какую роль они лично здесь несут, как конкретные индивидуальные личности. Переходя от теории к практике, был проведен анализ данных при помощи интервью и опросов в течение различных студенческих процессов, который показал, какова важность студенческого взаимодействия в таких радикальных ситуациях. Также была коллективная роль студентов в 2018 году против обязательной посещаемости. Студенты заявили, что они против постоянной посещаемости в принципе, потому что принуждение к посещаемости не может быть решением также и в борьбе против пропуска занятий, потому что на самом деле проблемой являются недостатки как ресурсообеспечения, так и недостаточное педагогическое обеспечение, может быть, недостаточная гибкость проведения занятий, и также большое количество других факторов, связанных с качеством образования. Принуждение к посещению занятий является лишь жесткой формой решения этих проблем, но никак не решает их по содержанию. Вы видите основные моменты, которые отсюда вытекают. Обязательная посещаемость не может послужить решением учащихся, их взаимодействия с педагогами и не позволяет им получить достаточное количество опыта и не может рассматриваться как самые хорошие факты. Вот в 2019 году был произведен протест против исключения визуального искусства из университета. Студенты распространяли постеры, и они предлагали вовлекаться в постоянный диалог. И это, конечно, являлось очень полезной деятельностью, но в 2019 году их заставили убрать эти постеры, потому что они были опасными для собственности университета. После этого они поменяли их содержание и снова повесили их на стены. Мы можем, конечно, не соглашаться, и мы, тем не менее, по-прежнему любить друг друга, если они, конечно, не запрещают их личной деятельности и возможность существования. Эти протесты являются символом нашей протестной культуры, и поэтому это позволило им понять лучше политику. И специфика этой деятельности заключалась в том, что студенты не должны быть ограничены нашей классной комнатой. Эти постеры позволяют понять нам, что взгляд должны быть более широким. Эти стены позволяют понять нам, что мы должны мыслить критически и не только в пределах учебников и лабораторий. Они также отражают мышление студентов, их желание выйти из каких-то специфичных иерархических структур и понять, перейти в какое-то более творческое пространственное взаимодействие. Конечно, это очень важно. И, конечно, последний протест, который произошел в Намибии в 2020 году, университет понял, что важно не только, в принципе, понять, что происходит, но и очень важно понять, что большинство из студентов, собственно, находится в маргинализированных системах образования общества. И если они не могут позволить себе образование, то будет достаточно большая сложность в их деятельности. И, конечно, сложность для них возникает и в социальной среде. И поэтому этот протест – это не только протест против администрации, но также протест против деятельности в высшем образовании в принципе. И также попытка решить проблемы с социальной справедливостью.
И прийти к переменам. Если послушать о аргументах студентов, можно было много обсуждения, преподавания, обсуждений, потому что это может быть спорить убеждение, что контроль обучения продвигает компетенции культуры студентов. И необходима позитивная система оценки. Также приводит к принятию эпистемологического плюрализма. Также это соотносится с идеей образования как направленного действия, а не неправильного действия. Потому что зачастую преподаватели также, они также направляются определенными идеологиями, и нам нужно рассматривать эти идеологии. И это также приводит к началу диалоги, как создавать коллективное действие. И как создать инклюзивную интеграцию, которая включает их культуру в процесс обучения. Также мы должны продвигать политическое воображение. Есть определенные сложности, которые имеют отношение к активизму, то, что есть напряжение в рамках партийного активизма, в противоположность активизма по ценностям. Большинство активизма проводится левыми организациями, которые склонны к идеям классовой борьбы. На что необходимо обращать внимание в университете. Есть определенная партия, партия студентов, которая принадлежит к меньшинствам. И есть обделенная доля общества. Такие группы необходимо поддерживать университет. Также есть и правый национализм больше имеет отношение к националистической идеологии, идеям патриотизма, единства нации, с одной стороны, с другой стороны, рассмотрение с другой точки зрения, что значит национализм для разных студентов, особенно для студентов, чьи права всегда притесняются, даже после 75 лет жизни при демократии. Также есть гендерный активизм на уровне университета, и тут мы говорим о роли критического образования, потому что критическое образование у него обладает потенциалом развивать осознанность среди студентов, которые подталкивают их к тому, чтобы исследовать их собственные позиции в социальной иерархии. И осознавая собственное положение в рамках системы подавления, вы приходите к положению сознания, где, возможно, вы захотите выйти из позиции подавляющего, но просто бывает такое, что в силу социального положения ты вел себя как подавляющая сторона, опрессор. То есть оставить привилегированное положение в обществе и занять положение, где, не покинув эту позицию, очень сложно организовать борьбу. Это приводит к осознанности, это заставляет вас выйти в ваше предвзятое положение, позицию. Если говорить о постковидный активизм. С начала пандемии 2020 года мы увидели, что все университеты в Индии были закрыты, и они еще до сих пор не открыты для студентов. И за эти 1,5 года многие университеты возникла ситуация, где студенты не смогли учиться, было огромное количество студентов, появилось огромное количество онлайн-ресурсов, и есть студенты, у которых нет никакого доступа к интернету, и даже при таких условиях университеты продолжали проводить формальные экзамены. И проблема была в том, что если у студента нет доступа к онлайн-ресурсам, как можно проводить экзамены, как человек может пройти сессию, сдать сессию? Это был вопрос. Тут в таких вещах активизм становится очень важным. Мы говорим о реальных переживаниях студентов во время пандемии. В рамках удаленного обучения это очень важный фактор, потому что люди, принимающие решения, должны мыслить с точки зрения людей, у которых нет технологического капитала, можно сказать. Может, они не привыкли использовать технологии в процессе обучения. Они, возможно, еще не знают, как пользоваться онлайн-ресурсами, исследованиями, как делать работу, как учиться. Это определенно нам нужен активизм. Он тут очень становится важным в том смысле, что невзирая на пандемию, невзирая на физическое отсутствие на кампусе, они организуются онлайн или посредством социальных сетей. И они проводят кампании в университетах по обмене решений и отстаивание маргинализированных групп. Например, запросы о переносе экзаменов или другие вопросы об онлайн-обучении. Так что активизм определенно становится важным аспектом инклюзивности университета, даже уже после пандемии.
Thank you so much, Monica, for your presentation. And I do not see any questions in chat at the moment, but maybe somebody who is present here have any questions to Monica. Before, while people thinking, I just would like to say thank you so much for bringing this idea of the university as a discussion point. So not only scientific discussions, but also the social discussion point. And we actually expect that the intellectuals who have an experience in scientific discussions can perform the same in social discussion. But unfortunately, it doesn't happen so much. So, and as Jean Piaget would say, we need a horizontal décalage here. Just which will be helpful to bring this culture of discussion, the culture of argumentation, the culture of presenting the own idea for the students and professionals, not only in the professional sphere, but also for the social sphere, and just to be same sophisticated in social discussions as they are in professional discussions. And yes, we have thanks from Igor Remarenko for the brilliant presentation, to Monica, and that's it. It looks like we're going to finish this session. And thank you so much for the participants, for Joe O'Hara and Monika Майни for your presentations. Thank you, Igor Remarenko, for the introduction speech. And now we have a coffee break. Unfortunately, we are not able to serve coffee here, but I hope everybody may help themselves. And we have a 15 minutes break, and then we will have another plenary session with two really interesting presentations, one from Taiwan and another one from Finland. And so please have a coffee break, serve the coffee for your own, and please stay with us, and see you in 15 minutes at another session. Thank you once more for the presenters.